Yeah, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Wolfgang Knöbel. I'm the director of this institute, and I would like to welcome you here at the Hamburg Institute for Social Research. As you will see on the screen, we are all waiting for the keynote by Ruth Wodak on Fortress Europe and Fortress Austria. But tonight's keynote is also the beginning of an international conference on the politics of demarcation and right-wing extremism. And we are really proud to have you all here, to have all the international participants here. And of course, it was a lot of work in order to organize this conference. And I would particularly thank the research group on democracy and the state here at the Hamburg Institute, and particularly those guys who did all the work, particularly Alexander Hobe, Laura Wolters, who is here, and where is he, Pablo? He's sick, and Pablo Schmelzer. And they did all the work, and thank you for all this, and I'm quite sure that we will have a wonderful conference. And now I think it's the time for Alexander Hobe, who will introduce you and will introduce particularly Ruth Wodak, and I'm sure we will have a wonderful talk and a wonderful beginning of a conference. So, see you then.
Yes, thank you, Wolfgang Knöbel, for this introduction. As Wolfgang Knöbel has indicated, tonight's lecture is part of a workshop organized by members of our research group on democracy and statehood. And Wolfgang Knöbel has already welcomed all the attendants to the workshop, but I will repeat this because why not? And let me also right off the bat express the collective thanks of all us, the organizers, to the team that helped us organize this workshop, especially to Una, Hendrik, and Markus, and also to the other members of our research group, Philipp Müller, Dieter Gosewinkel, and Katharina Troll, who discussed the far right far more than they maybe would have cared for in the lead up to this workshop with us. Let me also give you two brief organizational notes before I begin introducing Ruth Wodak, who has, by the way, asked me to maybe switch your phones to airplane mode while she is talking tonight. And the other organizational note for all attendants to the workshop, please stick around afterwards. We're going to go to the restaurant together then. Don't wander off. Unfortunately, it seems like we are forced to think about the far right a lot these days. When our group was planning and setting the date for the workshop, about a year ago, maybe even longer, we didn't know yet that it would be taking place shortly after, first, the inauguration of Donald Trump as US president, then the failure of Austrian coalition negotiations, which otherwise would have prompted the election of Austria's first far-right chancellor, Herbert Kickl from the FPÖ. And finally, last Sunday, the far-right AfD gaining 20% of the German elections, doubling their last result. And the list, of course, as you all know, goes on. However, even without knowing this, the times are such that we were pretty certain that we would have something to discuss even without knowing that these three things would take place. Now, if we all agree that the right is everywhere these days, doesn't that mean that the question raised by our workshop is a little strange? Indeed, observing the rise of the far right on all sides and all over the globe, it seems almost quaint to be musing over questions of historical and social generation and negotiation. And it seems very obvious what is right, as the title of our conference has put it. We would suggest, however, that this is not so, and that lots can be gained by reposing the question. In fact, any serious investigation of the phenomenon would have to begin with the question of what that actually is, the far right, and it would probably also have to ask if this designation always meant the same thing everywhere. If we are talking about a rising right, we would also have to know relative to what it rises, what the conditions of this relation are, and if these conditions changed over time. Thus, with our workshop on the politics of demarcation, we emphasize moments of conflict and negotiation, of struggle, of realignment and resorting, and of the political malleability of concepts rather than a rigid sorting into timeless categories. And there are few scholars more qualified to help us start to think about these questions than Ruth Wodak. She is Professor Emerita for Applied Linguistics of the University of Vienna and Distinguished Professor for Discourse Studies at Lancaster University. She has published widely and is the recipient of numerous awards. It would be too time-consuming for me to list all the awards, but luckily, one of these awards awarded by the Austrian Ministry for Women Affairs is called the Prize for Life Achievements, so maybe this is a bit of a summary. As a researcher, Ruth Wodak is one of the pioneers of critical discourse analysis, and her work remains an important reference point. Also, she is connected to this house by having published previously on the Wehrmacht-Ausstellung, which this house is quite famous for. Her interest in discourse analysis is very present in the remainder of her scholarly work, much of which is pertinent to the discussions we will be having in the workshop in the coming days. And again, it would take too long for me to list all of her work, so I shall restrain myself to just one of her more recent monographs, The Politics of Fear, the Shameless Normalization of Far-Right Discourse, published in 2020, and available in German and multiple other translations. And as you can see from the title, Shameless Normalization, it might have something to do with what she will talk about tonight. Now, Politics of Fear is a fascinating read, but you're not here to listen to me summarize it, but to hear from Ruth Wodak herself. So, Ruth Wodak, the floor is yours.
Danke. Good evening. Do you hear me well? Is this okay? Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. Thank you for inviting me for this opening lecture for this very interesting workshop, which I've been reading about. And thank you specifically, Laura, for inviting me, for organizing everything and answering to many questions. Yeah, it was really very kind and everything worked very well. And we had no problems with strikes or anything because we came with the Austrian train. And, and in this case, something did work well. It was already mentioned, all the different things which happened now just most recently in the last months. And I think we will be confronted with many other things which will be happening very fast. It seems that a motto of the Trump government is speed kills. That was a motto, it's not new. That was the motto of the first far-right conservative government in Austria in the year 2000. And their motto was speed kills. Yeah, so let's reorganize, destroy, reshuffle everything very fast so that nobody actually has the time to think about it or to oppose it. And it seems that this strategy now is being used by the United States government. And I just read a paper, which I will briefly talk about also later on, that Trump had 76 of his directives already implemented in the first month of his government. And of course, you know, when these things happen so quickly, it's very difficult to resist or to organize resistance or to oppose it or to have counter discourses and so forth. So, but I will not talk only about Trump. I actually want to talk about Fortress Europe and Fortress Austria, and I will explain briefly what I will talk about in my lecture. First, I will say a few words where this slogan or this this wording of Fortress Europe comes from, because it has an etymology and a history which is quite important to know. Then I will talk about some theoretical approaches to normalization. What do we understand with this approach? What is meant when something normalizes? Because everybody is now using this term. It has become quite inflationary. Even politicians now use it. And it's like the term discourse, which suddenly also flowed into every utterance also of politicians and journalists, and very few people actually know what discourse implies and means. So I think it's quite good to know a bit about, again, what does the theoretical approaches, and what do we mean when we say that certain policies are being normalized. Then I will give you an example, and I want to talk about Fortress Austria, or the Festung Österreich, which was the slogan of who you already mentioned, Herbert Kickl from the Austrian Freedom Party. They won the Austrian election on 29th of September 2024, and almost formed a government with the Conservative Party. And actually the Austrian model was talked about in the German media as something really negative for some time. Just look at Austria here. We don't want to have this. Well, luckily you won't, because Austria also doesn't have it. And at least not now. Yeah, you never know. And Germany also doesn't seem to have it. So we'll see what happens. And then I will come to some conclusions and perspectives, and I hope that we will have a good discussion. So let me start with the Fortress Europe, just a very brief history of the term. It was first used by the Nazi regime, especially to talk about the continent as opposed to the UK, and which was supposed to be defended. Yeah, it was a military propaganda term, and it was supposed to sort of defend against whatever was coming across the channel. Yeah. Then, after some time, after 45, it was used very much to refer to, in the Cold War, East versus West. Yeah. So Fortress Europe was the West. Yeah. Against the East. So it was the other side now, which was talked about. And in 1995, again, it was used very much as was proposed with Europe with the Schengen agreements, and otherwise sort of outside of Schengen, which was, of course, also and still is part of the European Union, because not everybody is in Schengen. And finally, it became again used very much with the refugee movement in 2015. I don't like to talk about crisis when talking about 2015. With the external borders, and I can remember especially Renzi talking about what does Fortress Europe mean. There were some really interesting articles and speeches at that time asking for help for the refugees who were drowning in the Mediterranean. Others were at that time debating how to actually already build a fortress Europe. And, you know, you can't really put a fence into the Mediterranean, but there were very interesting debates about that. So ever since, this fortress Europe has become sort of a symbol, yeah, of Europe wanting to defend itself against migrants. Yeah? So closing borders has become one of the indicators. All the discourse about closing borders, stopping asylum, which would be against European laws, and so forth. So Fortress Europe has become something everybody was talking about. Not only the right, but the far right has colonized that very strongly, and especially then nationalized that term, like you see with Fortress Austria. So then you would have all these nation states as little fortresses in a fortress Europe. I don't know exactly how that image would work, yeah, with all these little fences, but that is an imaginary which is implied by Fortress Europe if you continue thinking about it. So we could go on and ask, what does that mean? What are the main reasons for fear? Yeah, so obviously if we have to close the borders and have this Fortress Europe, so you're afraid of the migrants and refugees, or so-called illegal migrants and criminals and so forth. There's many terms which are used for the people who are not wanted. But if you look at the European Statista, yeah, the Eurobarometer, and the main reasons for fear from 2014 to 2024, I don't have a more recent graph, that's the most recent one. You see actually that the war in the Ukraine is the biggest factor which people are in Europe, yeah, are currently afraid of. So the insecurity, what does this war mean? Will the war sort of be extended? Is the EU, is Europe actually endangered? And people feel very insecure, yeah, because all of us can't actually do anything about it, yeah. Plus, lots of money is being spent for that war, and you know in Germany that has been part of many debates. The second thing which is most feared, and that is migration, immigration. So that has changed over the years, as you see here, because for some time, immigration was not the one thing which was most feared. Actually, it started very much with the many Ukrainian refugees or Vertriebene who came from the Ukraine. And as you might know, Europe and the EU currently has about 5 or more than 5 million Ukrainians, which are living all around in the EU member states. So that is the biggest number of refugees which we are actually dealing with, much more than Syrians and many other minorities. And then only comes, and you see here that also environment has dropped, which was also very clear in both the Austrian and the German election campaigns. It was not a big topic. And you also see that the cost of living, yeah, and that the finances also were not really talked about. So I think that although many people after the pandemic have a lot of existential problems, and also the EU countries have a lot of financial problems, so we can say, how come? Yeah, and I'm not a quantitative researcher at all. I'm a discourse analyst, But still, when we see this, we could ask, how come that the fears are focused in this way, although the problems seem to be also others? Yeah? Both climate, finances, cost of living, all these other crises. And what has happened that the fears are so big in these two, especially these two factors? And one of the answers, I think, one of the answers is the fear of loss of control. I think that the insecurities and uncertainties, and this is something Zygmunt Bauman has written a lot about, lie at the core right now of these big fears. And Wilhelm Heldmeier, a sociologist, has written a lot, which I think is fantastic work, on the loss of control, because that really has a massive impact on the subjective feeling of people of insecurity and fear. And who can solve that? Yeah? And there's a lot of work on insecurity. I just want to mention three possibilities of insecurity: existential, manufactured, and ontological insecurity. Existential is just when you have no money. Yeah, so that is obvious. Yeah, there is insecurity, which is material, an objective issue. Manufactured is through the media, through politics, when fear is constructed, and that can actually focus very many different things. Yeah, the sort of, you don't have the newest dress, which you should have, which makes you feel insecure, or you just don't comply to what everybody else is doing. So there are many ways of manufacturing insecurity. Or this is not my home anymore, yeah, because there are other people living here. And the ontological insecurity is a lot about these anxieties of issues which you cannot solve, yeah, which sort of really refer to, as the Swedish researchers say, to the consequent attempts to deal with anxieties and dangers where you yourself, your identity and autonomy are challenged. And that is, I think, really something which we have to consider when we talk about the rise of the far right, because they give allegedly some answers to these insecurities. And if you remember Brexit was about loss of control. We get our control back was the big slogan of Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. Well, we all see what Brexit actually led to, but it worked at that time. Yeah. So I think to understand the rise of the far right and why this politics of fear really works well, we have to also integrate crisis. And obviously, we are all living now, as Adam Tooze says, in a polycrisis. Yeah? There are so many crises which don't only add up to a bigger crisis, but to a qualitatively bigger crisis. Many people feel insecure. I guess all of us feel insecure because we don't know what will happen tomorrow, and very much has become unpredictable. This loss of control is very big, and that now I think supports, amongst other factors, the mobilization of far-right or right-wing authoritarian and extremist groups, because they suggest that they have answers. Yeah? They stage themselves as saviors, as messiah. Trump, yeah, who thinks God has helped him when he was almost killed in this attack, and they can save Austria, Germany, France, whatever country. They present themselves as saviors, also Marine Le Pen as Jeanne d'Arc, yeah, as the new Jeanne d'Arc, and the authentic voice of the people, and they know who's to blame. Yeah, so they have a scapegoat. That has also always been the case. It has always worked. There were the Roma, the Jews, the homosexuals, and now it's the migrants, and all of those groups, and the Muslims, and that seems to work, has worked, and seems to work. And the narrative is very simple. If we get rid of those scapegoats, we will solve the problem, so to speak, and that gives hope. And so you create hope and make America great again, or whatever country. So actually it's quite simple, but that narrative works, and it gives sort of an anchor for people who really feel left, not only left behind, but very insecure, don't know where to turn to. And there are lots of conspiracy narratives, and I believe that this has facilitated the normalization very much, and also a politics of emotions. I'm currently working about the impact of common sense, the politics of common sense, which, as you know, Matteo Salvini has actually done campaigns with common sense. So we all know what's right. We don't need experts. We don't need facts either. And we have something to hold on, and that works. So briefly, to come to some of these theoretical approaches to normalization, I want to start with one of the models which I think was actually the first one, which was very important, by Jürgen Link, who's a German literary scholar and cultural theorist, and who kind of proposed that we have like a Gauss curve. I don't know how you say that in English, but I hope you know what I mean. And that there's the center, and on both sides we have the margins, and then from the margins that curve can move, yeah, from the ones either to the left or to the right, because of course not only far-right issues are normalized, also progressive issues are normalized. If we think about gay marriage or other progressive issues, which we all hope won't be disrupted again, but sort of there is a balancing act of what works, yeah, and what governments do, and who defines the center, and that can be constantly redefined, yeah. And Link shows many examples in his book in his 2 or 3 books, how that works. Then I have also proposed a model of how, now just for the far right, how from the margins and the fringes up here, something can move first to various policy fields and then also use various genres to be implemented. So we first have lots of postings and social media, and then finally actually things can become laws. And I just want to give you one example from the Austrian context. There is an interesting notion called unwillingness to integrate. Integrationsunwilligkeit, yeah. German has this huge compositor, and it means that it was a far-right notion that children and parents of migrants who are Muslims don't want to integrate, yeah, and they don't want to take the swimming lessons, and they don't want to shake the hands of female teachers, and so there was big debates about all of that, and that came from the far right, was taken up by the mainstream parties, and now it has become part of a program from Lower Austria, that there will be sanctions if those children don't do these things, and also for the parents. And quite a lot of money, up to 2,000 euro. I just read this last week that Lower Austria is going to implement this as a law. So you see the trajectory, yeah, of certain notions which condense policies and which then become policies and even laws. And that is what we call normalization processes, which you can really trace. And not everything happens at the same time. Yeah? Something can first be only in interviews and later also written and then legal, or it stops at a certain level. So it's not the case that everything happens at the same time. And finally, a model which has been proposed by Michael Krzyżanowski, who's working in Sweden, in Uppsala, and he talks about 3 stages: enactment, gradation, and normalization. That first there is a new discourse, which is then taken up by some and recontextualized in various spaces, and then actually becomes part of everyday discourse. And he has traced that specifically in the discourse about refugees in Poland, yeah? Where partly this discourse actually draws on anti-Semitic tropes, and now it's anti-Muslim. Yeah? So the patterns are quite similar. And there are, of course, other models as well, but just to give you kind of a something to think about, which kind of metaphor you actually want to choose to talk about normalization. So what is normal? Yeah, and we were talking about Mr. Kickel and the AfD, and both these far-right parties have very clear ideas of what is normal. Yeah, so Mr. Kickel says Austria is normal. And what is normal? Somebody who's for freedom. And in that way, the far right has redefined the notions of freedom and democracy already during the pandemic. We call that flip-siding. So the same notion is being used with another meaning, and they take it away, so to say. All those are normal who deport criminal migrants, and he uses a very negative connotated word for that, and stops the Islamization as if only very, very bad Muslims, because there's a difference between Islamisierung and what kind of word you use for the Muslim religion and belief. And then finally against homosexuals and gays and LGBTQ+, whoever wants red, white, red, that's the Austrian flag, yeah, so the real Austrians, and doesn't want the rainbow, yeah, and the rainbow are LGBTQ+, yeah. And if you fulfill these issues, then you're not extreme but normal. Yeah, so you can kind of imagine how that curve goes to the right, yeah, which we were talking about. And in Germany, that was much simpler. Germany but normal, AfD, and then you probably have to read their program or listen to their politicians to know how they define what is normal, but it's not really different as far as I know from what Mr. Kickel says. So we also distinguish between normalization, mainstreaming, and backsliding, and I think some of these notions or terms are not really distinctive from each other. So I prefer normalization, which has this discursive component, but also material consequences, like I told you about with integration, unwillingness to integrate. Some talk about mainstreaming when they look at the actors and parties, but of course that's also interdependent with the discourses and policies, so we can say they normalize and mainstream. So the things from the far right are coming into the center, and the center is mainstreaming to the far right. Yeah, and we see that very much with conservative parties, where Jan Werner Müller rightly says the far right would never have all that success if the conservative parties wouldn't help them and support them. And we know that was already the case with National Socialism. Without the help of conservatives and the big businesses, the Nazis would not have come to power. And the situation in Austria was just like that right now, because big business supported the Austrian Freedom Party. It was really, quote unquote, interesting. Yeah? And then we have the term democratic backsliding, which is already the process of regime change towards autocracy, authoritarian regimes, and that is used very much for processes like in Hungary or Slovakia, where the undermining of democratic institutions is talked about. I think we can use normalizing, framing all of that, but I just want to show that there are different distinctions made. So how do we define shameless normalization? I define it as the far-right populist agendas reach the mainstream, the traditional post-war consensus is violated, so things all of us were used to don't work anymore. For example, I will give you examples. Lying, you can just lie, doesn't matter. Yeah? Nothing happens. Yeah? Continuous provocations, so the media are fueled by continuous provocations, which sell well, yeah, has an economic part, and the other agenda are backgrounded. And as I said, this is supported by usually mainstream conservatives, who then also moved to the right. Yeah? And in Austria, it was basically the Volkspartei under Sebastian Kurz, which really moved to the right and became a far-right populist party, National Conservative Far-Right Populist Party. So just to give you an example, because we were talking about Fortress Europe, the normalization of this protecting Europe from refugees and migrants, which is, if you look at 2014 we had a length of 315 kilometers of borders, and 2022 we have 20,028 kilometers of borders. These are borders from Hungary to Serbia, from Bulgaria, you know, all these, Finland is now constructing borders to Russia. So we have borders, yeah? And everybody wants borders. And Austria wants borders to Hungary, and the EU will be paying borders, and then borders from Slovenia to Croatia, Serbia. So all the countries now are building these walls. And there's also a universal way of talking about this, because, and we've looked at various speeches in many languages and countries, there are metaphors which are used all over. And Massimiliano De Mate and I wrote a paper about this. So we have the siege of migrants, yeah? The borders are defended by Hungary. It's all militarized, yeah? Then Orban says, I'm one of the captains of the border castles, yeah? Defending Bavaria from migrants which might come from Hungary. Trump says we have to stop that flood, so migrants are seeing in these waves and floods and invasions, and there are all these metaphors of nature, yeah, of terrible catastrophes which we cannot deal with, which happen. Same Netanyahu already said in 2015, we will not allow Israel to be flooded with illegal migrants. So that is kind of a universal way of talking about strangers coming into these fortresses, national, European, global, whatever. And Finland now, which is building walls on the border to Russia, again, we need independent border control against large-scale illegal immigration, meaning Russians coming to Finland. So this is just has become acceptable, yeah? And not only in Austria or Germany, this has become acceptable all over Europe. We again have the Fortress Europe, and then we have, as I said already, very many small national fortresses. Another term which I just briefly want to mention is coarse civility. Again, I refer to Wilhelm Heidmeier. I think this is, again, a brilliant way of showing how the far-right discourse is being made acceptable to the more conservative voters. Rohe Bürgerlichkeit is the term in German. In English, we've tried to translate it with coarse civility. I don't know if it's the best way of translating it, which means it's soft, yeah? Soft discriminatory utterances, soft politics of exclusion, because it's talked about in kind of a civilized, polite manner, yeah? And essentialized. We cannot do anything about it. I mean, these people will just drown, yeah, there's nothing we can do about it. And one of the examples for this was Sebastian Kurz, who was really regarded as the young wonder boy, especially also in the German media. Turned out he was, he had to resign because of corruption cases. And he said, when the first images of drowning refugees were published in the media, he said, it won't go without ugly pictures. We will have to become used to that. Yeah? There's nothing you can do about it. Es wird nicht ohne hässliche Bilder gehen. And that is something where, this is acceptable. It didn't say stop asylum, yeah, or something of that in that kind. It's sort of just factual. Yeah, there's nothing we can do about it. So I think that what we are confronted with, and the German migration scholar Bastian Vollmer has talked about it, is a moralization of bordering. Some people deserve to come and others don't. Yeah? And that is what we observe. So we all want specialized workers because the EU member states need these workers, but we don't want so-called unqualified migrants. And then there is a sort of a mix up of migrants and refugees. Yeah? So refugees are framed as migrants as well. And so we don't want those. We only want the qualified workers. And even the far-right parties agree that, Germany, Austria, and so forth, they need those qualified workers, but they should leave again. Yeah? And that I find so interesting, that people don't learn from history. We know that they don't learn from history, obviously, because the Gastarbeiter, is the same phenomenon again. Everybody thought the guest workers would come as guests, yeah, where they weren't treated as guests, but they came and they worked, and then they would go. But interestingly, they stayed, yeah, and married and had children and integrated. And so, again, we are confronted with the same kind of idea about they will leave again, yeah? And another example of this coarse civility which I want to give you is the use of euphemisms. If you look at the debates about the new asylum pact, migration and asylum pact of the EU, which is probably going to be implemented now shortly, you see a whole lot of different euphemisms which are being used for deportation and actually detention centers, yeah? And Hannah Sommer, who's writing a PhD about this, has collected all these different lexemes or words which are now being used as euphemisms, and actually only the European Parliament talks about detention centers. All the other member states, the European Council, everybody else is talking about waiting zones, accommodation centers, people in holding, departure centers, closed control access center, and the fiction of non-entry, where you are in detention, but you're not yet in this other country, but you have already left the other country. So they're all very interesting ways of reformulating and euphemizing something which we are confronted with, which is really detention centers at our borders. Yeah? And the nation states will be the ones who will be accountable for that, and they are the ones who will implement these European laws. So I just want to point you to these interesting discourses and the way this is framed to be made acceptable. And I was really surprised to see that in the European Parliament they have very clear ways of talking about this. So I want to come to my example about Austria. And Austria first, America first isn't the invention of Donald Trump. Austria first was already used in 1992, and Germany first also existed before that. And we had a very interesting development, which I could talk long about, but I will not, from Jörg Haider, 92-93, with a referendum for Austria first, opposition to the far right, the so-called Lichtermeer, the Sea of Lights, with 300,000 people gathering against the far right, the biggest demonstration ever in Austria, never happened again. Yeah? And now the Fortress Austria. So we have this trajectory from Austria first to the Fortress Austria. And I want to show you how that has, again, been mainstreamed as well, normalized and mainstreamed. So it's not only Herbert Kickl who's using Fortress Austria already. Former Chancellor Nehammer from the Conservatives used that and said, you know, we must finally break the taboo of fences, or fences in themselves are nothing new. Nation states have been left alone. The EU Commission has not released the funds, so we have to build this. And the way this is usually justified is by using certain arguments. And I don't want to go into argumentation theory, but you might all know that still from logic, which all of us had sometime in school, yeah, that you can point to epistemic knowledge, sort of the common sense, and you don't have to actually spell out the whole argument. And this is what is being done all the time now in discourses about this protection of our nation states against immigrants. So we have certain arguments which are used all the time. For example, they are a too big burden for us. Yeah, that can be in costs, but they also in education because they are illiterate, or also because they come from a different culture and they don't want to accept what we say, we, the Austrians, or what is called the topos of historical conditionality. The Geneva Convention was designed at a different time, yeah, long ago. We have to change that now to adapt it to new phenomena, or the topos of threat. Yeah, they are an enormous threat to our culture, to our life. There are many terrorists who are coming, and all of this is constantly being repeated and used and accepted, yeah, because everybody knows what is meant. So the politicians don't have to spell this out. Yeah, they don't have to give us the statistics or the arguments or the so forth. They just have to say that they will not integrate, and everybody knows already what is meant. So, just to give you one example from the Fortress Austria, where Kiko says, think of mass migration, dear friends, where instead of a Fortress Austria, which was necessary, the beautiful country was turned into an asylum magnet. So these metaphors are always really very strong. They have a huge emotional impact. So it's a metaphor of nature, yeah? So Austria is like a magnet pulling everybody in. And where all the asylum seekers home, as we had locked them up, are now being opened again, one after the other. And this is a lie. It's just not true, yeah? And the symptom of mass migration is the success of organized international crime. So these are the conspiracy. So there is a huge international crime, and that's why all these refugees and migrants are coming. And, you know, he says that on the 1st of May, 2023, a big speech in front of thousands of voters. Yeah, I mean, people were writing about that, but there was no big opposition, no big scandal. So what does this Fortress Austria look like, this new normal? And we ask ourselves who should be allowed in. So if you really think about that, almost nobody is allowed in. It would be a most boring country, yeah? Because we only speak German. Also in schools, also in the breaks, no more multilingualism. We would have no career women. Women should stay at home, no abortion. And if you look at the program of the Austrian Freedom Party, you see that women actually should be, and they should get this, what is called Herdprämie, a bonus if they stay at home. Money. LGBTQ not accepted. No more interventions from Brussels. Brussels dictatorship is the term for that. Closing borders, asyl stop, using Umvolkung, which is a Nazi term. Then in their program, they also use the term remigration. I think I don't have to explain this here. No politics about the climate crisis. People who are fighting or doing something against the climate crisis are labeled as Klimakleber and climate terrorists. And of course, no critical press. And, you know, go on, go on. And then Kiku says, let's follow Orban's example. Let's build Fortress Austria. He says that all already 2023. So my question was always, why are people surprised that he wants that? We know that, yeah? If you follow it, it's just unfortunately, media, you know, you forget everything after a week, at least already after a day. So people were surprised, you know, when they entered the negotiations. What does this guy want? Well, everybody knew what they want. They would just read the program, apart from the pro-Russia stance. So if we look at their sort of argument, which goes through the whole program and all the speeches, is, so who saves Austria? The FPÖ has always already proved that they work in Austria's interest. That's a very simple Tulmin argument. And if they have already successfully managed to do that, they will do that again, and they will make Austria great again. And this very simple argument works all the time, yeah? And it's underlying most of the speeches, which don't really have very complex structures, because, you know, it's a repetition of that. And just to show you, in a quantitative way, we looked at how Fortress Austria was used in the newspapers already in 2021. Kikel started using it, yeah? So also that is not new. Already during the pandemic and obviously post-pandemic populism, that has worked very well. And I think we still underestimate what the pandemic really meant for the rise of the far right. I'm coming to the end. So conclusions. I couldn't resist. I had to say something about what is happening right now. And the question is, will we have a fortress states, United States? Because if they are so isolationist as they seem to be going, we have a big wall which is being built to Mexico, and the way these two people are currently governing in the US, we see really the shameless normalization of anti-liberal and anti-democratic policies. There's a really very good paper by Pagel. So this is how liberty dies. I can really recommend that from Substack, because she lists the different areas where now all these different directives are happening and what that really implies. So just to sum up, what shameless normalization facilitates as catalysts, the normalization of undemocratic policies and measures by mainstream political parties. And I just list some of the issues which are part of this. Yeah, not everywhere everything is happening, but you should become aware of these issues happening and not just say, you know, this will pass and then in 4 years we can vote again and so forth. So it implies an undermining of the checks and balances. Lying, yeah? I mean, I could give a whole lecture about lying, what that means. But if you follow how acceptable lying has become, and it just doesn't matter, yeah? Facts and opinions, what already Hannah Arendt said, are just equalized, doesn't matter. All the rules and conventions are flouted, institutional rules are violated, and this is, I think, where it really often starts, suppressing dissent and controlling information. And that's what we see in Slovakia very strongly. I don't know how much Slovakia has talked about, but it's a day-to-day process which you can actually follow. Parallel discourse worlds are established, so you know, they don't talk to each other anymore. They just live in their own fake news, yeah, disinformation. science, environment, health, arts, education, everything is attacked, which again goes back to the pandemic, where a lot of this started. Yeah? And we see this step-by-step transformation of pluralistic democracies into authoritarian regimes. Now, just not to end on this terrible thing, I just give you one last slide about the perspectives, so which we could actually talk about. What can we do? Yeah, because I think just losing control is not what we should think about. And again, I think it's a very interesting notion. Avoid the status quo bias. Yeah, that people still act as if it remains intact, as if nothing is happening. Yeah, or you just deny it, or you euphemize it. Yeah, it's not that bad. It will pass, and so forth. I think this is bad, and we need to be very aware of these small steps, because they're small steps. It's not big coup. Yeah, and I think we need to know that driving on the right doesn't help, because the far right can do it better. We know that, so that won't help. We need alternative programs for existing problems and not to deny them, which was long time the case with migration. There, it has to be talked about. We need to create positive narratives, support independent media. I think this is really important. And start in the schools teaching critical literacy, which is something which the British do, and I think is really fantastic that you start learning to read and challenging texts, yeah, or images, and not taking things for granted. So, and I would like to stop here. I've taken too much time. Thank you very much. I still have, so if anybody wants the reference to some of the stuff, you can look at it, and otherwise, finito.
All right. Thank you very much, Ruth Wodak, for this lecture. The way this is going to work is I'm going to ask maybe one or two questions to give you guys a little bit of a time to warm up or cool down, whatever you prefer. And then you'll have plenty of time to ask your own questions. So I'll also leave you some time to.
Yeah, I'll just fetch my glasses.
Yeah, that'll be a good idea.
Thank you.
So. Maybe the first question I would like to ask you is right on your title, Fortress Europe. And you sort of began your lecture by giving us this genealogy of uses of this expression, which leads back to the Nazis. I remember a different kind of use of how this concept was used from a different time. And that's sort of also, it was used in like a left-wing critique of the migratory regime, which was associated with Dublin, and of course the Dublin system, which of course also sort of already implied a sealing of the European borders to migration, right? And of course the Dublin system predates the rise of the far right now. So I guess my question would be, how do you get that to relate to your story of normalization? Is maybe the what the right is doing actually sort of verbalization of something that Europe has been doing all along, or is something else happening here?
Well, that's a really good question. When I mentioned Renzi, he was actually, as far as I remember, he was opposing this Fortress Europe, and was talking a lot, and many other Italian politicians and also Greek politicians at that time were overwhelmed because people were coming and they got no support from the rest of the European Union. So they were actually appealing for help, but they were not saying, we want to close this. Yeah? The Greeks perhaps more than the Italians at that time, but maybe Massimiliano knows more about that. But I remember very well, and we did a big study about that, which I couldn't talk about, is in Austria. There was this left-wing critique, and there was the far right and the conservatives. And there was huge debates, 2015, about two issues. How many? Should there be a limitation of numbers, Obergrenze? You have that too, in Germany, or should it be possible to have refugees coming and we have to take them because that is the Geneva Convention? Yeah, the left had the latter, and the right had the Obergrenze, yeah, limitation of numbers. These two issues actually condensed entire ideologies. So you just had to mention Obergrenze or Geneva Convention, and everybody knew you were left or right. Yeah, and basically there was this controversy, and then the right won, specifically because the discourse shifted after Bataclan and after the New Year's evening in Cologne. So there was a big discursive shift, and then everybody was talking about the limitation of numbers. And the left actually was, they didn't give up, but they were backgrounded, yeah? Because these two events were so terrible and so basically focused upon that nothing else had any space anymore, and there could just be small compromises. How big would this limitation of numbers be? So up and down and so forth, but there was no discussion about it anymore in Austria. I don't know about Germany. So that was basically the end of this left-wing critique at that time, yeah? And we followed it through all the national newspapers, again, day by day, and you could really follow it, how these terms were used, how also the adjectives accompanying migrants shifted, how the sympathy certain shifted into a very bad narrative. So first it was still Ayan Kurdi, and you remember that, this small boy, and refugee welcome, and all of that. And then this terror act happened in France, although that were not refugees, yeah? And then the Cologne happened, and it was also not refugees, but this sort of dominated the discussion. Mm-hmm. I don't know if a similar study exists in Germany. It would be interesting to know if the discourse and the controversies at that time went in a similar direction or not. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My next question is in a slightly different direction. I'm gonna use a cue you gave me in your lecture by saying you could hold a whole lecture about lying.
Yeah.
One other thing from your title that I wanted to pick up on is this issue of shamelessness, right? And I think in your work, the shamelessness sort of refers to also to this kind of way in which rude manners and lying, as you said, sort of functions in a very odd way to help the far right being successful. So I was just wondering, maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more about lying and shamelessness and how that actually translates into success.
Well, there are two sides of shame. I mean, shame is a very important emotion, and in some cultures it's even more important than guilt. for example, in Japan, yeah, and there are interesting studies about, you know, shame can be really terrible, but at least it's an emotion all of us, and a feeling, emotion, all of us are socialized in. And sort of via shame, you structure sort of what is allowed and what is not allowed, usually, yeah? Conventions, politeness, and you're ashamed if you do something wrong, and so forth. So children are socialized into what is right and wrong, and what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. And now by violating and flouting all these politeness and conventional norms, Trump, for example, can present himself as a very big man, very strong, macho, also this toxic masculinity. Yeah, he says all the things you aren't allowed to say. Yeah, so finally somebody says that, and it also they and not only Trump use this slogan: "I say what others want to say, but I say it. I dare say it. I'm so courageous. I'm so brave that I say it." Yeah, and that is something which gives those leaders a lot of votes. Yeah, so people who have always thought that can finally have somebody who says that. Yeah, who is as sexist as they always wanted to be, as racist, as whatever, but you weren't allowed to do that. And that also allows them to be against so-called political correctness, which they say forces you not to do all that, which is a completely strange meaning of political correctness. And finally, you're allowed. So it's actually emancipative, yeah? If you see it from that side, it's an emancipatory way of finally showing what you want, yeah? And that is something which especially, obviously, some voters of the far right feel encouraged. And that's how it works. So the shamelessness has an emancipatory function.
I see.
Yeah, okay. As well. Yeah, apart from causing scandals and provocation and thus getting into the media, it also has this sort of positive effect for some, which, for example, teenagers sometimes, I remember that from my son, when they test out the borders, yeah, and you can finally do all that what your parents always said you shouldn't do. Well, that's children, yeah, but obviously it works for older people as well, yeah.
We are all grown-up children, I guess.
No comment.